Good morning. So I think I mentioned in the introductory presentation in this poetry learning unit how important words are in poetry, in part because, generally speaking, a poem's going to use fewer words. And so for that reason, maybe, and for that reason alone, word choice, word order, and tone become very central to our initial understanding and maybe our initial appreciation of what a poem may have to reveal to us. So word choice then is extraordinarily important when it comes to any discussion of poetry. So the first term we want to introduce is this idea of diction. It's a term that if you study poetry you will come across. Diction literally means word choice. So when you open a dictionary, right, you have a lot of words from which to choose. And I love this quote by one of my favorite writers, Mark Twain, because it reveals really how a writer views the importance of his or her words. The difference between the almost right word and the right word is really a large matter. It's the difference between the lightning bug and the lightning. So one of the easiest ideas to identify and to process when we pick up a poem with regards to diction, that is to say a poet's choice of words, is the poet's level of formality. And again, this is something that we process almost immediately and sometimes subconsciously. So poetic diction, traditionally speaking, is virtually extinct. It's a very highly elevated choice of words. Poets in the 18th century, the 17th century, the language was extraordinarily formal, very difficult for the average person probably to read, and even more troublesome for modern readers to try to read and more importantly to enjoy. Okay, today. Levels of formality is typically broken down into three categories. Formal diction, again, is still going to be very high, elevated language. The middle diction, and then the informal diction. And informal diction can be even further sliced and diced up into the colloquial, poets who rely on dialect, and poets who incorporate jargon into their poems. We're going to talk just briefly about each of these. So here's a little example of poetic diction. On the left side of the screen here, you see what an 18th century poet has done to a passage from Proverbs 7:6. And you can see how the poet has elevated the language, made it extraordinarily formal, and somewhat detached, I think, from the average person. How long shall sloth usurp thy useless hours, unnerve thy vigor, and enchain thy powers, while artful shades thy downy couch enclose, and soft solicitation courts repose, amidst the drowsy charms of dull delight, year chases years with unremitted flight, till want now flowing, fraudulent and slow, shall spring to seize thee like an ambushed foe. Right? Very, very stiff, very stilted language, very hard to cozy up with. And here we have a more original translation of the proverb. How long wilt thou sleep, sluggard? How wilt thou arise of thy sleep? Yet a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to sleep. So shall thy poverty come as one that travaileth, and thy want as an armed man. So we see that a poetic diction is an extraordinarily inflated use and choice of words. Okay. If you study English literature, if you're an English major, you may come across a very important poet in the English tradition, the Romantic poet William Wordsworth. And it was William Wordsworth, really, who was one of the very first poets writing in English to move away or to depart from that poetic diction. In other words, Wordsworth believed that poetry should be accessible, it should be enjoyable, and should be read by by the common person on the street. And so with his famous work, Lyrical Ballads, he set out to take the inflated language of poetry and bring it back down to ground level and try to create a poetry that was meaningful in words that everyday people could use. So Wordsworth, and then later people like Coleridge, William Blake, and the English tradition followed suit. On the American side of the Atlantic, the very first poet who really begins to do that is Walt Whitman in the 19th century. He is the one who takes language and creates a body of work that is accessible to the everyday person. So we still have these concepts: formal diction, middle diction, and informal diction. We can still encounter these three levels of formality in almost any poem. The formal diction is going to be exactly that. It's going to be language that seems still somewhat elevated, dignified, and perhaps a little bit impersonal as you read it. Middle diction is the kind of word choice that relies on the vocabulary that is spoken by most educated people. And then there's another level of informal diction, and this is very easy to identify. This is colloquial, conversational vocabulary, word choice, where a poet might even introduce a speaker who speaks in a dialect. So, in other words, he's using words and terminology that's tied directly to that person's geographic location, social class, economic class. And then finally, you may come across poets who rely on jargon, which is just vocabulary that's tied to a particular profession or a particular trade. So all of these ideas are associated with the idea of word choice. And again, you have to remember that poets always have that choice on how they want to craft their poems, what kind of voice they're going after in the creation of their speaker. Remember, a poet can create poems that have different speakers. In other words, different voices. So that's sometimes a hard concept for students to grasp, the idea that the voice that we hear in the poem is not necessarily the voice of the poet. In other words, it can be an artificial construct. It can be a fictional persona, a speaker that is presenting to the reader his kind of his experience. Okay? So word choice, again, something we pick up pretty quickly just by looking at the words on the page, and as we begin to read, we can assess at some level, this seems very formal, this seems kind of, well, maybe not quite so formal, or in fact, this seems extraordinarily informal. It's conversational in its nature. So much of what makes poetry relies heavily on these concepts of denotation and connotation. Okay? And it is because words have these three components, sound, denotation, and connotation, that we have, in fact, the whole notion of what poetry is and what it can achieve through our reading of it. So words have these three components or dimensions to them. Okay, so you may have never thought about this, so it's high time that we do. There is, of course, sound, and sound, as we know, is pretty straightforward. It's what you're hearing right now. It's the phonetic utterance, it's the tone, it's the noise that's created by the lips, the tongue, and the throat of the speaker. So sound is important when it comes to word choice too, as the poet is selecting those words for his or her poem. And this goes back to that idea that poetry is meant to be read out loud. We're supposed to hear that word, the sound, phonetic quality to it, okay? Back to that idea that language in and of itself is a musical entity. These other two notions are notions that you may or may not be familiar with, concepts and maybe even the terminology. So let's spend some minutes talking about this, the idea of denotation. and connotation. Denotation is the dictionary meaning of the word. It's what the word means literally. So if you look up a word in the dictionary, what the dictionary will provide you is the denotative meaning of the word. It is the literal meaning of that word. Okay? By contrast, the connotation of a word, when we use that term, what we're discussing and what we're interested in finding out is what is suggested beyond the literal meaning, beyond what it expresses, its overtones of meaning. So connotation is all the associated images, suggestions, implications, and allusions that a single word can bring up. Okay? The simple way to remember the difference between these two, okay? I like simple ways to remember things. Denotation starts with a D, and so does dictionary. Okay? So if you can remember that, then denotation is always going to be the dictionary meaning of a word. The connotation of a particular word then is the associated figurative meanings, everything that is stirred up in our imagination and our emotions when we encounter a word. For example, the word rose, R-O-S-E, the noun, not the verb. But if we looked at the dictionary and we looked up the word rose and we found the noun definition of that, it would be something like a flower, right? But it may give us the genus and the species of it, but it wouldn't go too far beyond that, right? It's a biological plant, a flower. But the connotation of rose, that word, that noun in this case, think of all the other ideas that come up when we read that word. What are some of them? What are some of the ones you're thinking of right now? What does a rose somehow symbolize? Does it symbolize love? Does it symbolize romance? Does it bring to mind other things, right? Love, like I said, fragility. So when we start exploring the implications and the suggestions and the allusions of words, that's where the connotative meaning comes into poems. And so when we're reading poetry, of course, we have the literal words on the page. We have the denotation there, right? These words mean what they mean literally, the denotative meaning, but we also can't forget that whole idea that each one of these words has the possibility of stirring up other words and other ideas and other associations. And it's in that play, it's in that interplay of words between the denotative and the connotative, between the literal and the figurative, where poetry achieves its magic, where poetry becomes more than words on the page, but emotions, right, and interpretations, and so forth. So denotation and connotation, okay, two really big terms that you should be familiar with as a student of poetry. So let's move on to this idea of word order. I think it was at the beginning of the previous presentation where I introduced the idea of Emily Dickinson's, that those lines from her poem, I dwell in possibility, a fairer house than prose. And somewhere in that presentation I made that observation, or I made the observation, that in poetry there's a certain amount of freedom, there's a certain amount of liberty that the writer of prose fiction does not really enjoy. In other words, prose fiction writers, they have to be very concerned with their word order, right? They have to write in complete sentences. They have to follow the rules, in other words. Otherwise, the reader gets confused. And in English, you know, the typical syntactical formula of the English sentence is subject, verb, and then object, right? I ran to the store. The subject is I, the verb is ran. To the store is a prepositional phrase, but it tells us where we went, right, to the store. So the poet, though, is not tied to the rules of grammar and the rules of punctuation or the rules of syntax. So word order, when we talk about word order, the technical term for that is this term syntax you see before you. Literally means the ordering of words. And when we talk about syntax as it relates to poetry, we're interested in finding out, or we're interested in discussing how the poet's use of syntax creates an effect. In other words, how the poet orders his or her words in a way that creates an effect for us as the reader. So in Emily Dickinson's poem about the snake, A Narrow Fellow in the Grass, she has this line, his notice sudden is, right? And so when we read this phrase, his notice sudden is, we stop and we pause because we're not used to that word order. We'd be more used to reading what? His notice is sudden. But Dickinson doesn't want to do that. Dickinson wants to put sudden before the verb. His notice sudden is. Why does she do that? She does it for an effect, right? Because when you see a snake in the grass, what happens to you, right? I mean, boom. It's like, ah, right? We're frightened. And so by her moving that word in front of the verb, she's able to simulate in the line of poetry the same emotion that we feel when we come upon a snake in the grass, right? So pretty cool idea. Pretty smart of her. This line of words, his heart large, the grass green, is not from any line of poetry. It's just an example of a technique that John Milton used to use. And I can remember learning about that when I took a Milton class as an undergraduate, and we were reading Paradise Lost, and we noticed this construction in his lines of poems where he has this habit of putting the adjective after the noun that it's modifying. Usually in English, our adjectives become or come before the noun, right? So we would say normally his large heart, the green grass. But in the Miltonic adjective technique, he will play with the syntax, again, for emphasis and for effect, by switching that order, by putting the adjective after the noun. So, again, just something to be aware of as we are looking at poems. Not only are we looking at diction, in other words, the word choice, we're also interested in looking at any particular use of syntax for effect. Let's move on to the last main idea in this chapter, and that's the idea of tone. And tone is a pretty simple thing to detect most of the time. When we are talking about tone, we're talking about a poet's attitude. And I just looked at my slide there, and I've realized that I need an apostrophe between my T and my S in the word poets. So please forgive your English professor for not putting his apostrophe there. So, a chink in the armor at 9:20 in the morning. So tone is defined really as the poet's attitude toward, oh God, here's another error, I'm so sorry, toward his or her subject. The mood created by the various elements of the poem. See, we're human. We're human beings, okay? Again, tone is the poet's attitude or the mood that is created by all the various elements of the poem working together. It's what we come away with as we're reading. It's how we feel. How does that speaker seem to be... what state of mind does the speaker seem to be in through the rendering of the experience as we read through the poem? Does the speaker seem melancholy and sad, or is the tone light and happy, filled with joy and celebration, or is it serious, a serious subject like death and mortality? So the tone again is somehow achieved through, again, a variety of elements that all kind of come together. And a lot of these things come back to that very first concept that we talked about, that idea of word choice, right? And the denotative and the connotative meanings of those words, and even the sound of those words as we read through them, okay, and all that they suggest as we read through the poem. A very famous poem by Randall Jarrell is called "The Death of the Ball Turret Gunner," which is a very moving and very powerful poem about a ball turret gunner. And the ball turret gunner was a soldier who sat in the turret underneath a bomber in World War II. I think they were B-27s. And you've all seen them. They were kind of the plexiglass bubbles. And the ball turret gunner sat in there crouched up, and he had a very large caliber gun. And it was a very, very dangerous position, very vulnerable to attack and to death. And so this is exactly what this poem is about. But it's a very, very powerful poem, especially when you read the last line. "When I died, they washed me out of the turret with a hose," right? So the tone there is very easy to detect, isn't it? What is the tone there, right? It suggests a certain detachment, a certain callousness, a certain criticism, a certain anonymity of the individual, right? Where it's just the soldier is disposed and so disposable that when he dies, his remains are washed out. And then the implication for us as we put down the poem is the realization that once they washed him out, what do you think happened on the next mission, right? They put another one in there. So a very powerful poem by Randall Jarrell, and it's one that is one where we can readily detect the whole idea of the tone, that speaker, the poet's attitude toward the subject. A few terms to consider as well. The dramatic monologue is a kind of poem where the speaker reveals some aspect of his or her personality or his or her temperament. Robert Frost was a user of the dramatic monologue. He used this technique quite a bit in his poems, his kind of long narrative dramatic poems, like a poem like Birch's, a poem like After Apple Picking. These are examples of dramatic monologues. E.A. Robinson did it a lot as well at the beginning of the 20th century. I'm thinking of Mr. Flood's Party, a great example of a dramatic monologue. An allusion is, now this is a term to be aware of too. An allusion is when a poet makes a brief reference. Oftentimes it's a cultural reference to a person, a place, an event, or a thing. And it's a very nice way to add an interpretive layer to a poem. Remember, I've made the observation several times that in poetry, compression and economy are paramount to a poem, simply because the poet has fewer words, right? So if a poet is wanting to add something additional, a different dimension, and introduce a whole nother level of conversation in the poem, he or she can throw in an allusion to something that he knows that the reader will be familiar with, right? So, for example, when Paul Simon, right, is singing Mrs. Robinson, and he sings, "And here's to you, Joe DiMaggio, a nation turns his lonely eyes to you." That allusion to Joe DiMaggio is important because it represents and symbolizes to America a time of innocence, a time of a nostalgic time of the past, right? So allusions pop up all the time, though. T.S. Eliot, right? If in the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, if we can refer, he makes all kinds of allusions in his poetry. Too many, really, but an allusion to John the Baptist, for example. What does that suggest to you? He says, "I don't want my head brought in upon a platter." Right? He never says John the Baptist, but he refers to, or he is making an allusion to something that, to an event that he knows most people will be familiar with. So again, it's just another nice way of creating an effect by introducing an idea, a cultural event, a cultural name, a thing, a place, and by doing so, it adds an extra dimension to the poem. And then finally, your book references the carpe diem phrase. And if you don't know what carpe diem is, it's high time that you learn that. It's a Latin phrase that means seize the day. And some of our finest poems in the English tradition are written in this tradition and fall into this category of making the most of the time that we have, with the understanding that time passes very quickly and that we only live once, and we need to make the most of every single moment of our life. And so this is a theme that is recurrent in so much of our finest poems. I guess the equivalent today is YOLO, right? You only live once. But we want to use carpe diem. You'll sound a little more dignified and a little more sophisticated if you use that instead of YOLO. That's all I have. This one went a little longer than some of the others, and for that I apologize. But I hope that as you think back on this presentation, you remember how important word choice is, the level of formality that we can encounter in a poem, the concepts of denotation and connotation, the ideas of tone, the ideas of word order, and some of the other techniques that poets can use, like dramatic monologue. They can use allusion, and then this wonderful category of poems called carpe diem. I'll see you next time.